the session is all about. And it's something that most companies have embraced, and research has shown us that the companies who have embraced Agile comprehensively have been successful. So today's session, we are going to, Stuart is going to take us through in terms of how to implement the Agile in practice. She's going to take us through in terms of how we can change our mindset, because Agile is about the mindset change. And as we all know that with COVID-19, we've all seen the speed of how everything has changed, how everything, the magnitude of speed of collapse of our economy. We have seen things falling apart. The sort of things that we thought we knew, actually, they have since changed. In fact, it actually requires people who are more flexible in terms of their responses. This is what Agile is about. It's about being able to see the opportunity. It's about being responsive. It's about being flexible. And again, one of the things that we have all seen is that the management, rather the organizations, had to allow the employees to actually work from home. So that actually requires organizations that are able to see, to empower their teams. And it's one of the key things within Agile is about teams, empower teams, self-organized teams. So today's session is going to take us through all of that process and take us through in terms of understanding what Agile is. And we've got Stuart Nolands is from the company called Nolands Capital. They are advisors in this field. They're going to help us in terms of understanding the principles. They're going to help us in terms of understanding the practices. Okay, so my name is Pelisa Shandu, and I'll be your helping you in terms of hosting this event. In terms of the rules, we would actually prefer that if you've got a question, write it on your chat box, and then at the end of the session, Stuart will get the opportunity to answer some of your questions. Okay. So I'm going to now hand over. The program has actually been presented already. You can see we've got a lineup of people who will be taking us through the program. We will have our acting dean and head of GSB, Professor Martins, who's going to give us a welcoming address. We'll have the introduction of the speaker by Dr. Oli Majola, and then our keynote address by Mr. Stuart Nolands. And then at the end, we will have a session where we'll be able to ask some questions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Professor Martins.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shandu. Hi, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to this Graduate School of Business and Leadership webinar series. This is an initiative that serves to empower our students, alumni, and business partners with knowledge that will enable us to navigate the unprecedented challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic has affected everyone across the globe. Indeed, the world we are now living in requires a shift in current mindsets and the need to adapt to a new normal set of circumstances in the post-COVID-19 era. In order to achieve mutual trust, we need to gain mutual understanding among all team members. And we can do this by being agile, resilient, and able to apply creative and innovative approaches, new techniques, new strategies, in order for us as individuals and businesses to successfully navigate the waves of change that are brought on by COVID-19. So this GSB&L webinar series is intended to be insightful and inspiring. Our stakeholders are enlightened by the experts we host in order to develop their capacity and become upskilled so that they can share this with their own communities. Indeed, this will enable us to foster a healthy symbiosis to ensure the sustainability of our ecosystem. So thank you, everyone, for those of you that are present here today. I'd like to hand you over to Dr. Oli Majola, who will introduce our guest speaker of today's seminar and who is Mr. Stuart Nolands. Thank you, and over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Martins. Greetings, everyone. Greetings to our acting dean and head of school, Prof. Anna Martins, and greetings to our guest, Mr. Stuart Nolands, and greetings to all our guests at large. So my duty is very simple right now. I'm here to introduce Mr. Stuart Noland, and he was born and raised in Cape Town, lived and worked in Cape Town, London, and Johannesburg. So his education background includes Master of Business Administration from University of Oxford, Finance and Valuations Modeling Program from University of Oxford as well, MCOM Finance and Risk Management from University of Cape Town, Postgraduate Diploma in Accounting, CASA, from University of Cape Town, and also honors in Finance and Accounting from University of Cape Town. So his experience includes auditing for KPMG in Cape Town, advisory for KPMG, as well as consulting, Bain and CO Africa, and then strategic finance, Kabusha Nolands. His working style includes Myers-Briggs, sustainability, feedback, idea generation. Industry experience includes financial services, agriculture development, finance, insurance, retail, industrial goods and services, consumer goods, telecoms, and logistics. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to welcome Mr. Stuart Nolands. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. I'm just going to try and share my screen quickly. Dr. Yalezo, would you mind just stop sharing so that I can share my screen, please? Thank you. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Shandu. Thanks, Prof. Martins. Thanks, Dr. Majola, for the very kind and warm and welcome. And welcome to all the participants of the call today. Thank you very much for giving up some of your time today to join us for today's seminar. So today, what I'm really going to be taking everyone through is how we can apply Agile in practice. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Agile. You may think you've experienced Agile in the past. And it's really become a very trendy topic in the last 3 or 4 years, especially now with COVID. And I'm sure you're very aware things have been changing very, very quickly. Things are not what they were a couple months, couple years ago. You don't know if we're in lockdown, out of lockdown, and we need to find a way of working in which we can adapt to change very, very quickly. And so Agile, in my view, is that way of working. It's something that I've both worked with and implemented at different businesses all around South Africa as well as Africa. And the feedback that we've had from businesses that have adopted Agile in their business has been very, very positive. Agile is one of those things that is quite difficult to understand by just reading the theory. It was developed by software engineers, and through the success of being used in the development of software, it has then been moved into application in other businesses. So what today's session is really to do is to give you a basic understanding of some of the theory of Agile, but Agile is really best experienced through application.
So,
I mean, Agile,
okay.
when you...
Well, leave you to do this and then we'll decide what all next. And then I'll come back to you. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, would everyone just mind muting, please, if you're on the call? Thank you. Sorry, can everyone hear me? There we go. So Agile has become a very trendy topic, and it's often been thrown around as a way of different people trying to sell different projects. So if you speak to paper companies, they'll tell you that Agile is about using plenty of sticky notes and documenting your thoughts and sharing them around the office. If you speak to consultants, they'll tell you that the most important part of Agile is using their software that they can implement in your business. And if you speak to orthopedic shoe companies, they'll tell you that the most important part of Agile is having your team on their feet and walking around the office and meeting each other face to face. So what I'm going to try and do in this session is debunk a lot of those myths and actually explain to you how you can easily implement Agile in your businesses to improve both your productivity and to empower your teams. So another important thing to note about Agile is Agile is not a framework, it's not a methodology, and it's not a piece of software. Agile is a set of core principles and values that you use to optimize your way of working and minimize wastage and yield loss in your business. And there are different methodologies that we can use to help apply those principles of Agile, and that is what I'm going to be taking you through today. So the objectives of today's session is I'd like to outline some of the basic principles of Agile. I would like to highlight the positive impact experienced through Agile adoption at some of the clients that I've worked with, understand the Agile manifesto and what the key principles of Agile are. We're then going to dive a bit deeper into the most popular Agile framework, which is called SCRUM. And we're going to understand the relevant components of that framework, and as well as how to use them. I'm going to take you through how we can use Sprintboards to improve our team's productivity. And lastly, we're going to discuss how Scrum fits together and how you can actually begin application in your workplaces. So currently Agile, as I mentioned, it's been a very trendy topic. And if you speak to a lot of people or businesses, most of them, if not all of them, will say that they run a very agile operation. And they've actually recently done a study, and of the top Fortune 500 companies, 97% of them reported to use some form of Agile in their business. However, only 20% of them are using it properly. But if you then look at the top 100 Fortune 500 companies, over 70% of those businesses are using Agile properly. So there's definitely a link between larger businesses that are successful in growing their market cap and the use of Agile. So as mentioned a bit earlier, I'm currently working at a business called Nolands, which specializes in audit, advisory, and law services. And we're based all over South Africa. We've got 9 offices in South Africa, and we've got 5 offices internationally. Just before we move on with the session, I'd just like to put a few reminders of some guidelines down. So it's always very difficult in a webinar. Sometimes it feels like you're talking to yourself in the mirror. But I would like you to participate in the session, and I have got some interesting participation tools to enable you to do so, which we'll discuss in a little bit. If everyone could please mute their microphone and their video if you haven't already done so. Some of the participants are on slower internet connections, and it does impact the connection for everyone if your video is on. So please will you do that now? And lastly, as mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please will you either take note of them in front of you, or you're welcome to write them in the chat box, and we will address those questions at the end of the session. Great. So in order to enable participant polling, I've set up an online polling tool. So if you either have access to your mobile or access to your computer, please go to pollev.com/StuartN840 in one of your browsers. And that will enable you to participate in some of the polls that we are conducting today in terms of some of the questions, and to provide me with some feedback as we pass through the session. So I'll give everyone maybe 30 seconds to 45 seconds to go to that link, pollev.com/StuartN840, and that will enable you to participate as we proceed through the session today. So once you've managed to get to that link, I've left it, it's at the top of the screen, pollev.com/StuartN840. Let's see if you can start entering some of your names in the question boxes and answering some of the questions. And we should see some of the responses come through once you've done that. So hi, Chris. Hi, Stephen, Melanie. Here you go. I see some of you got the hang of it. Anna, Michelle, Rishan. Great. I'll give it another 30 seconds to try and get everyone on the board. Okay, fantastic. So it seems like we're everyone getting the hang of it. If we go to, now we can start with the first question. So the first question I want to ask to understand everyone in the room is, have you been exposed to Agile or Scrum in the workplace? So yes, no, or yes, but informal. Okay, very interesting. So it seems a lot of us have understood or been exposed to Scrum or Agile. That's very exciting. Okay, so it seems like we have quite an even split, which is quite interesting. So I think the session will appeal to everyone. There's lots of bits and pieces that everyone can pick up, but it's definitely going to give you a very good foundation as to how you can start exposing your teams and yourself to being more agile in the workplace. Great. So the next question I want to ask is, when you think of agile, what words come to mind? So if someone was to say, are you agile in your business? What words come to mind to explain what agile is or whether you're agile? Fantastic. So responsive, adaptable, quick, efficient, swift. You can see some of the good words. There's lots of flexibility. So the larger the word in this diagram, the more often it's been mentioned. So we can see the key points coming through here is being responsive, being adaptable, and being flexible. Very, very good. Great. And I see rapid and speed is also getting a bit bigger. And I think you're 100% right. So we will touch exactly on what Agile is in a little bit, but if you're really going to be Agile, you have to be flexible, you have to be able to adapt, and you have to be responsive. So that's fantastic. So I guess the first question is, if not Agile, then what? What is the old way of thinking? And the old way of thinking is traditionally been the waterfall approach. And whether you applied this waterfall approach in terms of selling products, or whether you applied it in terms of developing new products or developing software or anything in between the spectrum, it always followed a very similar pattern. You started off with a very heavy analysis phase where you had meeting after meeting after meeting deciding what the scope of the project should be. You then entered the design phase where you started planning how that scope was going to unfold. You then implemented what you designed earlier. You then went into testing and review to see if what you designed actually meets the scope and actually works. You then went into deployment phase where you started releasing the product or the service to your customers. And then lastly, you went into a release and maintenance phase or warranty phase where you just assisted and serviced the customer who's purchased that product over time. Now, this approach has a number of strengths, but it also has a number of shortcomings. So before we move on to what Agile is, I'd like us to try and discuss what exactly are some of the problems or pitfalls with this waterfall approach to project execution. So very briefly, what maybe in your businesses, in your teams, you would have experienced some problems down the waterfall. So I'll give you a moment. Fantastic. So slow, very, very good point. Delays, fantastic point. So this waterfall I mean, in some cases can take 9 to 12 months to get you from analysis phase all the way to deployment. It's rigid, time consuming, inflexible, drawn out, fantastic. Delays. So you'll see in the waterfall, some of the big problems are that the arrows are always pointing downwards in this waterfall. And by nature, that's what a waterfall is. It's waterfalling from the top of a hill downwards, which means that if you have a problem in the implementation phase, what do? You basically have to stop operations completely, or stop implementation completely, go all the way back to the design phase, halt everything below, and restart, which is very, very, very time consuming. It also has multiple layers of approval. So the analysis needs to be approved. The design needs to be approved before you can move to implementation, which needs to be approved before you can move to testing. So, and great comment, it's very, very dependent on many, many people. It's also very high risk because the first time your customer actually sees the product is when it gets to deployment phase, which means that if your analysis was slightly incorrect, or as an example, in COVID, if you had planned for a non-COVID world in your analysis phase, but you're only deploying in a COVID world, you now have very, very different requirements and you've wasted the design, the implementation, and the testing phase for nothing because your deployment doesn't meet customer requirements. And often what happens is you start your planning phase before you actually know what your customer wants. So these are some of the issues. Let's see what else we've brought up here. So to change that by increasing the time to implement project if we need to go back to previous phases, fantastic. A lot of bureaucracy and a lot of delayed feedback. And these are some of the issues that Agile attempts to solve. So how does Agile differ? So in Agile, the process initially looks very similar. However, it's broken up into a lot smaller, more manageable pieces. So in Agile, you do planning first. But when you do planning, you plan just enough to get to build a minimal feature set for your product. You then build what was planned. You test and review that small set that you've built. You review it, and then you have what is called a potentially shippable product. Now, the main difference is in Agile, instead of this process taking 9 months, because you've planned such a small minimal feature set, this process can actually take between 1 and 3 weeks. And what happens is it keeps getting repeated again and again and again and again over time. And ultimately what happens is at the end of the day, once you've added up each of these potentially shippable products over time, you end up with your end product that is ready to be released to your consumer. And these different iterations of Agile are what are called sprints. And we'll touch a little bit more on exactly what a sprint is in a little bit down the session. So the key differences between Agile and Waterfall is that Agile breaks up problems into a lot smaller, more manageable, incremental pieces. So instead of having perfect plans from the outset and entirely avoiding risk and failure, you move towards rapid adaptation, learning, and recovery from failure. So you're constantly trying new and innovative things. And if they don't work, because your sprints are so short and you're being reviewed so often, it's not the end of the world. You just put that failure behind you and you try again. In the waterfall process, everything is equally important. Everything gets designed up front and is assigned to a different person, and everyone is very fragmented in their multitasking. Whereas in Agile, there's a laser focus and a very, very big focus on prioritizing things that are most important and executing things in that order. In Waterfall, you have a lot of diplomacy, a lot of bureaucracy, and the power comes from the top, and you're, as a team member, you're told what to do. Under Agile, there's a lot of transparency, honesty, trust, and a lot of delegated power. So similarly, instead of having layers of internally focused approval, you have customer-focused design and employees that are empowered to make their own decisions. And under Waterfall, instead of having a very individual performance-based, under Agile, you have a lot more collaboration and alignment. So Agile was originally developed, as I mentioned earlier, for software development. It then moved into a lot of military and crime implementation or implementation. But the first big use that you may be able to relate to is the release of Microsoft 3.1 versus Microsoft Windows 95. So under under Windows 3.1, it was released under the old waterfall process, where everything was built, and it took 8 years to develop Windows 3.1. And then it was all released, and any issues that arose from that process were only addressed in the next iteration of Windows, which was Windows 95, which was 3 years later. Whereas Windows 95 was developed using Agile. And you'll notice Windows 95 was the first version of software where initially Windows 95 was very basic, and each week more and more features were added to Windows 95 over time, which was the implementation of Agile sprints, consistently improving the software over time. What that meant was that the features they were adding in Windows 95 were features that customers were directly requesting, rather than features that were designed 8 years prior when like they did with Windows 3.1. So if we're looking for an analogy to explain the difference between waterfall versus Agile, I think the best analogy we can use is the analogy of going on a road trip. So waterfall is like going on a long distance road trip by train, whereas Agile is like going on a long distance road trip by car. So if you're going on a train trip, if you've planned your journey completely and there are no roadblocks, so there are no stations that are out of order, you don't miss any of your connections, then it's a fantastic way to travel. But if you're traveling by train and suddenly a station is closed because of a COVID outbreak or because there's a problem with the train and you can't make your connection, now you have a very, very big problem. Whereas if you're traveling by car and you've got a good navigator in the vehicle, when you hit one of those problems, it's very easy just to navigate around it and make a change. However, on a train, you've got to backtrack all the way back to your previous station and then replan your entire journey from there going forward, which is very, very complicated. So if your train connections work, it's great. If you miss your connections, waterfall is a very, very big problem. On the train, you don't have to talk to your colleagues along the way. Everything's planned up front, and once the journey's planned, you can sit in separate coaches on the train, and if everything works well, you can get to your end destination. However, in a car, you have to consistently talk to the navigator and the driver each step along the way to make sure that they know exactly what's happening and they can make the right turns as they go. Sorry. So both a train and a car can crash. And I think that's a very important point to make. Both waterfall and Agile can fail. However, on a train, you have no control over whether you crash or not. You are led by the rest of the system or the rest of the carriages, whether you crash or not. Whereas in a vehicle, if you start feeling uncomfortable and if you start experiencing danger, it's very easy to pull over on the side of the road, stop, assess the danger, make the required changes, and then adapt. And that's one of the key benefits of Agile. So what were some of the challenges that Agile needed to solve? So these are some of the big problems that businesses were facing. So they realized there were a lot of plans that were being created and endorsed, but immediately became redundant when things changed. And I'm sure a lot of businesses in COVID will have experienced exactly that. There were a lot of creative ideas, especially from some of their top employees. But for these employees' ideas to become a reality was very, very difficult because the employees didn't have the voice or the power to turn those or to ensure that those ideas saw the light of day. There were very competent employees who were sitting around unmotivated because they were being micromanaged and just being told what to do. And there was a lot more time spent with internal reviews rather than actually engaging with your customers. So a lot of people ask, how successful is Agile and why? And this was a study that was conducted by Bain & Company, which is a large consulting firm. And for all projects, the success rate on Agile, projects that ran Agile, was 39% versus a success rate for projects that ran on Waterfall of 11%. And on large projects, the success rate was 18% on Agile versus 3% for Waterfall. So you can see there's a very, very, very big discrepancy between project success rate on Agile versus Waterfall approach. And that's simply because times have changed and the environment is changing a lot quicker than what it used to. And what were some of the key benefits that were reported by Agile users? So of people that used Agile, 87% of people reported that the ability to manage changing priorities was much, much easier. 84% reported that it increased their team productivity. 79% reported that it increased team morale and motivation, as well as improving faster time to market and reducing project risk. So those stats, I think, speak for themselves. The people that have started using Agile, and more specifically Scrum, have definitely seen the benefits coming through. And what's very interesting is if you asked a lot of these people before they implemented Agile, if they thought it was necessary, a lot of them would have said no. It's human nature to not enjoy change. A lot of people are comfortable in their roles. They've been doing it for a long time and they're very resistant to change. But if you go through call it the pain of moving to a different way of working, I think the benefits you can see speak for themselves, which are self-reported from people who've implemented Agile. So then what is Agile? So as I mentioned earlier, Agile is a set of values that was developed in 2001. And the Agile manifesto on which those values are based is really just a 97-word paragraph that explains different priorities in a business. And those priorities are on the screen in front of you. So whereas the traditional approach places emphasis on processes and tools, the Agile approach places more emphasis on individuals and interactions. So instead of logging calls and sending emails, it's actually physically going and speaking to the people that you work with and meeting with them on a daily basis. Instead of valuing comprehensive documentation and spending all your time in the back office documenting what you've done, it more values actually developing working prototypes that you can share with your team and customers. Instead of valuing contract negotiation and what's been agreed upfront with the client, it values actual customer collaboration. So working with your customer along the journey to actually develop something that they want rather than what's been maybe agreed initially. So a great example of this is often your customers don't know what they want until they're further down the line. And a famous quote was from Ford. He said, if you asked his customers what they wanted before he invented the motor car, they would have wanted a faster horse, right? They wouldn't have wanted a motor car. So what this means is even if your customers in contract negotiation ask for a faster horse, you should be involving them along the design journey. And by involving them in the actual design journey and collaborating with them directly, you will eventually lead to them wanting a motor car. And lastly, instead of following a plan to the T, we move towards responding to change and being a lot more adaptable. Now, Agile is not saying that things that are on the left-hand side of the screen are not important, because they are important and they will continue to be important. You cannot not have processes and tools, documentation, contract negotiation, and following a plan. But what it is saying is the things on the right of the screen are more important than the things on the left. And when you're put in a situation where you need to choose between one, you should always favor what's on the right-hand side of the screen. So as I mentioned earlier, Agile is not a framework or a methodology. It is a set of values. However, there are a number of methodologies that have been developed that are used to help implement Agile in the workplace. And by far the most popular methodology is called Scrum. So 66% of people who have implemented Agile in their business have reported using Scrum. The other ones that are less popular are things like Kanban, which was invented by the Japanese in the Toyota factory, Scrumban, which is a mixture of Scrum and Kanban, and then a number of other ones below. But they all share very common ideals. They all break projects into smaller components and tackle them in bite-sized chunks. They're all about continuous improvement and creating team efficiencies and increasing performance over time. They all have rapid feedback loops, increased adaptability. They use transparency to drive the process. They're very, very focused on customer collaboration and eliminating waste, minimizing the work in progress and minimizing yield loss, as well as empowering teams and respecting people and leveraging the strength of your workforce. And ultimately, it's a big shift away from one of these things, which is called a Gantt chart. I'm sure many of you have seen them before. And this is often the tool that's used at the beginning of a waterfall project to design exactly what's going to happen by each person in each division across a whole year or 2-year project. Which, as you can imagine, if something doesn't go well on the left-hand side in one of the early phases, it sets everyone down the line back significantly. And so in this chart, all requirements are needed up front. It's very difficult to respond to changing market conditions. It's possible, but it takes a significant amount of money and time. It really lacks customer collaboration because the first time your customer gets involved is at the end of the process. It's got very rigid contracts and timelines. And as a result, it's very, very slow to get to market or to get your product to market. Okay, so that's it for the theory of Agile. I now want to move on to something that's a bit more key, which is what does Scrum look like? So as I mentioned earlier, Scrum is the framework that you can use within your business or your organization or your team to help apply Agile in a very practical manner. So what we've discussed up until now has been good in theory, but to constantly ask yourself the question, how do I increase customer collaboration or how do I increase team collaboration? If you don't have a practical approach in which you can apply that, it's actually really difficult to do. And unless everyone in your team and in your workplace is on the same page and really understands what their role is and how they fit into the process, it is really difficult to practically apply Agile in the workplace. So Scrum helps us do just that. So the magic number with Scrum is 3. So in Scrum, there are 3 roles, 3 artifacts, and 3 meetings, or ceremonies, as the meetings are sometimes called. And if you can remember and understand these 3 roles, 3 artifacts, and 3 meetings, you'll be able to apply Scrum and therefore the principles of Agile in your workplace. So I'm now going to take you through each of the roles, artifacts, and meetings. So to start, the 3 roles for the Scrum framework. Firstly, you have the product owner. So the product owner is the person that's responsible for defining the features or the scope of the product. He's the guy who has the bright ideas that the team needs to execute. He's asking himself, what should my business be working on? You then have someone called the Scrum Master. And the Scrum Master is a servant leader to the team who facilitates the Scrum process and makes sure that everything runs smoothly through each sprint. So the Scrum Master's main question that he's asking himself is, what process should my team be following? And lastly, you have the Agile team. And now your Agile team is a team of 3 to 7 people, normally a cross-functional team of people from different divisions around the business. So a very mixed team. And those team members are responsible for executing the different sprints and the work on a regular basis. So your product owner sets the vision and the roadmap. He constantly prioritizes what the business should be working on in terms of a big set of master initiatives. He's the one who is engaging with customers and stakeholders and executives and different people around the business to identify what is important and what the business and the different teams in the business should be working on. He is ultimately responsible for the delivery and the inspection and the approval of any of the work that's done. And he's responsible for building and refining that product backlog, which we'll speak about in a little while. But in most businesses, the product owner is normally the division head or the CEO, depending on the size of the business. The next role is the Scrum Master. Now, the Scrum Master is responsible for coaching the team and keeping the product owner honest. He's also responsible for facilitating daily stand-up meetings sprint planning meetings and retrospectives, which we'll speak about in a little bit. And most importantly, he's responsible for making work visible, protecting the team, and ensuring that any impediments that the team members are facing are removed. So any issues or problems that the team is encountering, the Scrum Master is responsible for navigating these problems and ensure that they are removed so that the Agile team can do their work. The Agile team is exactly what it sounds like. It's that cross-functional, multidisciplinary team of 3 to 7 or 3 to 6 people. They are self-organizing and they decide how they are going to do the work. They are not told how to do the work. They are told what initiatives to work on by the product owner, and they are assisted by the Scrum Master in clearing impediments and facilitating the work, but they ultimately decide how they execute the work. And they're self-managing, so they decide how much work they can do each week or in each sprint in order to meet the goals that they need to set. But most important is they are collaborative. So they work together to achieve the sprint goal that was set at the beginning of the sprint. So those are your 3 roles: your product owner, your Scrum Master, and your Agile team, are each asking themselves, what process, and how are we going to do this? We then have the 3 artifacts in the Scrum framework. So your 3 artifacts are your product backlog, which is a prioritized list of items that need to be completed; your sprint backlog, which is a prioritized list of items that the Agile team selects from the product backlog that need to be completed during that sprint, as well as the sprint output, which is the minimum shippable or minimum viable product that's completed by the Agile team during the sprint. So remember your product owner from the previous slide. He's responsible for managing the product backlog, which is a ruthlessly rank-ordered list of initiatives that the team needs to execute over time. Now, your product backlog might have initiatives that could last 9 or 12 or 24 months in total. But what's very important is you start with the most important initiatives at the top of the list, and then you end with the least important initiatives. So your teams are constantly working on the most important issues. And only detailed planning is done for initiatives at the top of the list. All the initiatives down the list, the detailed planning can happen at a later stage. Your sprint backlog is a visible real-time list of prioritized tasks that are required to complete some of the items in the product backlog. So what on the diagram in front of you, your sprint backlog will only show you items that need to be completed that are applicable to feature A in the product backlog. And feature A will be broken up into a number of smaller, more manageable tasks that the team needs to execute during that sprint to be able to complete feature A. And the sprint backlog is displayed and tracked on something that's called a sprint board, which we will speak about in a little bit. But that sprint board makes work visible and ensures that everyone, both the Scrum Master and everyone in the Agile team, knows exactly what everyone in that team is working on at any point in time. And then lastly, the third artifact is your sprint output. So your sprint output is the key output that's created during that sprint. And the sprint output allows the team to showcase their work and get feedback from the stakeholders and customers before proceeding to the next sprint. So every single sprint, you'd set yourself a sprint backlog, which would be a list of items that would need to be completed in that sprint. And once those items were completed at the end of the sprint, those items together would form your sprint output, which would be something that could be shared with both your stakeholders and your customers for review to make sure that the stakeholders and customers are constantly being involved in the production of each feature during each sprint. So those are the 3 artifacts of the Scrum framework: product backlog, sprint backlog, and sprint output. Then we have the 3 meetings or ceremonies of Agile. So the 3 ceremonies of Agile is you have your sprint planning meeting, and that's the meeting that happens before the sprint starts to plan the activities of the sprint. You have your daily stand-up, which is a 15-minute meeting every day, which updates the team and improves communication. And then you have your sprint review, which is the meeting that happens at the end of the sprint to share the results with the different stakeholders and customers. So to delve a bit deeper, your sprint planning meeting aligns the whole team on the goal of the sprint. The sprint planning meeting often has your Scrum Master as well as your Agile team, and the product owner can also attend if required. And out of that sprint planning meeting, the team develops that list of prioritized backlog items for the sprint, which is the sprint backlog that we spoke about earlier, plus a plan for how that team is going to deliver that sprint. So who in the team is going to be responsible for which item in the sprint backlog. Your daily stand-up meeting is really there to ask 3 simple questions. It's a 15-minute meeting and it's capped at 15 minutes every day. It's not an onerous meeting. You're not providing everyone with these long-winded updates that sometimes happen that just take time and aren't very beneficial. You're only answering 3 questions. Each person in the team recaps what they did yesterday, decides on what they're going to do today, and raises any roadblocks or any barriers or impediments with the Scrum Master so that the Scrum Master can clear those issues to enable them to proceed. And that meeting of just asking those 3 simple questions always make sure that the team is aligned as to what everyone else is working on and the progress of the sprint. It also means that if someone has completed more work than they thought the day before, they can then assist someone else in the team to reduce their load and vice versa. So it helps load balance the team and ensures that everyone is working again on the most important issues at any point in time. And then lastly, your sprint review meeting. So your sprint review meeting reviews the work and output of the sprint and allows the team to get feedback from both the product owner and stakeholders and the customer. Now, the one thing we haven't spoken about is working rhythm, and also known as sprint rhythm. So what's very important is for this process of Scrum to work, you need to decide on a rhythm that suits your organization in terms of how often this process is going to proceed. So the recommended rhythm is somewhere between 1 and 2 weeks. But obviously, depending on the type of organization and the type of business that you're in and what you're trying to deliver, that number can range between 1 and 6 weeks in certain circumstances. So to summarize, we've got our Scrum framework. We've got our 3 roles, which are the product owner, the Scrum Master, the Agile team. We've got our 3 artifacts, the owner backlog, the sprint backlog, and the sprint output, and our 3 meetings or ceremonies, which is the sprint planning meeting, the daily stand-up, and the sprint review meeting. You'll see I've put +1 there because there is another meeting that you'll often hear referred to, which is called the sprint retrospective meeting. Now that meeting is just when the team gets together on a regular basis and assesses how they've been working together in the past and discusses what they can improve going forward. Now that meeting doesn't necessarily have to happen every sprint. It could happen once a month or once every 3 months or 6 months, but it is something that can be applied to help improve the team working together. And these different teams could be multiple teams across your business. So your team doesn't necessarily have to have one sprint team. There could be multiple sprint teams that are all acting independently on different initiatives over or throughout your business. But what's very important is all those teams are acting on the same 3 core Scrum principles. The first is make work visible, and that's where the sprint boards come in. So at any point in time, anyone in the team knows what everyone else in their team is working on. The second is to co-locate where possible, and where you can't co-locate physically, you co-locate using technology. So we all know at the moment it's very difficult with Scrum, it's very difficult with COVID. And all being in the same place. Some people are working from home, some people working from different offices all over the country, over the world. But as long as you can use different tools to co-locate on a technological basis, it'll still work very well. And lastly, something that's often overlooked is these are cross-functional teams, which means that it's not a team of pure salespeople in one team, a team of purely operational people in team 2, a team of purely operational people in team 3. In each of these teams, you have someone from sales, someone from ops, someone from engineering, someone from marketing, etc., across each of the teams, to make sure that the team is taking into account the full value chain of the business, and that everything is constantly being iterated on in each occasion. And all of these activities, as I mentioned earlier, operate in the context of sprints. So what is a sprint? We have touched on it, but a sprint is that name of the iterative methodology used in Scrum. So it's a short time-boxed period when the Scrum team works to complete a set amount of work that they've set themselves. All your sprints will have the same length. So if you decide that your sprint is 1 week, every single sprint will be 1 week long, and every single sprint will follow that same working rhythm where you have your sprint planning meeting, your daily stand-ups on a daily basis, and then your sprint review at the end of the sprint. Those short iterations enable the product owners and the stakeholders and the customers to get feedback faster, which is critical, and allows them to give and review comments to the team on a much more iterative basis. And each sprint should contain a predefined definition of done that the sprint team sets, as well as the predefined acceptance criteria that the product owner sets. So in that sprint meeting at the beginning of the week, everyone is very aligned as to what needs to be completed by the end of the sprint in order to meet both the definition of done as well as the acceptance criteria, which the product owner will have defined based on consultation with both the customer and other stakeholders in the business. Great, so I hope that gives a much clearer idea to everyone as to exactly what a sprint is and how it works. Now, there are a number of tools which we can use to manage the sprint backlog or to manage the sprint process. There's digital and online tools which work best for online collaboration, especially when the team is situated not in the same location. You can also use basic Excel or Microsoft Teams to manage your sprint backlog. And due to the increase in use of Microsoft Teams and SharePoint, this is also something that's very useful. Or you can use what is the more traditional method, which is a physical sprint board. And your physical sprint board is obviously best for teams that are co-located in the same room and can easily transfer work from the sprint backlog to the sprint board. So in times of COVID, I've also just put together a bit of an example as to some digital tools that you can use that will make your lives a lot easier if you're trying to start implementing Agile. So obviously we spoke a little bit about Microsoft Office. I think most employees have access to Microsoft Office. It's very easy to use. However, it can be a bit clunky if you're updating Excel documents and sharing them between each other. There can be things that are missed. So it is a little bit, so it's simple to implement, but it can get a little bit complex if your sprint boards get very complex. There's then a tool called Trello, and this is personally my favorite tool. So this is a simple, user-friendly online tool. It's free to sign up for anyone, and it's just basically an electronic version of a sprint board that you can set up, and everyone on the team can have shared access to the same sprint board and can move their tasks along the sprint board as they proceed. One of the big negatives about Trello is that information is not secure, so it doesn't have any additional authentication. So if you are working on very confidential projects and using client data, that can be a concern. While it is password protected, it is not, there's not additional encryption in Trello. And the last one, which is the most complex, is something that's called Jira. It was recently bought by Atlassian, which is an agile software tool. So that has very, very complex data validation and encryption. So it's very, very secure, but it is also very, very complex and very difficult to use, and team members need to be trained to be able to use it. So my recommendation, if you are looking to implement something digital, try and explore Trello. It's a free service, and as long as you're not putting in any information that's too confidential, it's a very, very good tool to get familiar with and try and use in your teams, especially during COVID times. if you do have the luxury of having everyone being co-located into the same room or the same location, by far one of the best and easiest sprint boards to use is a physical sprint board. And it's a pity that we're doing this over a webinar and I can't actually physically be in the room with everyone to show you how this works, but I've tried to put together a little diagram of what a sprint board looks like so that we can get an understanding of how you can start using one in your team. So a sprint board is basically a way of documenting the sprint backlog. This is separate from the product backlog. The product backlog is something that sits on the side of the sprint board, and each week or each sprint, the team decides what items on the product backlog they are going to break down into items that go onto the sprint board. So the sprint board has 4 columns. It has a to-do column, a doing column, a for review column, and a done column. So, and it's as it sounds. So at the beginning of the week, everything is going to be in the to-do column because nothing will have been started. And then as the week progresses, it'll move into the doing column, the for review column, and ultimately to the done column. And at the end of the week, all your little sticky notes will be sitting in the done column. Now, why this is so nice is it's a very good visual representation, not only as to what everyone is working on in the team, but also the progress they are making each day. So you can quickly see when someone is falling behind and restructure your resources to assist that person to make sure that by the end of the week, you have that micro deadline that's been hit. And as you'll know, it's much easier to hit a big macro deadline if you focus on a lot smaller micro deadlines, for example, each week, than it is to try and plan your time over a 9 or 12-month period to try and hit the end deadline in that case. But because by the time you realize you're behind, it's almost too late to catch up. So each sticky note on this board will explain what the task is, which team member is responsible for that task, and more or less how long that task is expected to take. So what the size of the task is. The color of the sticky notes indicates the week in which the task was started. So on this board, you'll see there are a couple of sticky notes that are blue, and those were sticky notes or tasks that were due to be completed the previous week, but for some reason or another, they weren't able to be completed and they've rolled forward. So this easily shows that whoever's responsible for those tasks needs to catch up those sticky notes this week and prioritize those sticky notes to ensure that they remain on track to meet the micro deadlines. Each sticky note is listed in order of priority from left to right, so that everyone knows that the next task they do is always the sticky note to the left, so everyone knows that they're working on the most important activities. And as I said earlier, the sticky notes will move slowly throughout the week from left to right. And this goes back to one of the core principles of Scrum that we spoke about earlier, which is making work visible. So as a Scrum Master who's responsible for managing the sprint board and facilitating the team, it is very, very easy for them to identify who's doing what progress they're making, what they're working on, and whether they're on track to meet the micro deadline or the sprint deadline at the end of the week. So in terms of these daily stand-up meetings, very, very, very important. They are critical to make sure that you improve the communication within the team. They are time boxed to a maximum of 15 minutes. And depending on your team size, there's no need that they even take 15 minutes. In my experience, if everyone has been running Agile and running Scrum for a while, 5 to 6 minutes is enough for everyone to get through what they need to communicate. The product owner only needs to attend if he's specifically being asked to attend by the Scrum team or the Agile team. He's just there to provide specific guidance if they need further guidance around the scope or what they should be doing. But normally the product owner can spend his time interacting with the customers and with the other executives in the business to make sure that his list of backlog priorities are correct. And then the sprint team, the reason why it's called a daily stand-up is exactly that. They actually stand up. And the reason everyone stands up is because it reduces the likelihood of the meeting going over time. And it also encourages people to be active and engaged rather than just sitting down and looking at their emails and doing other things instead of being engaged in the short meeting. And the beauty of it being such a short meeting is that everyone can afford to give 5 or 6 or 7 or even 10, 15 minutes of their time on a daily basis to make sure that everyone is aligned on what everyone is doing. And remember, the 3 questions they ask themselves are, or explain to the group, what did I do yesterday? What am I doing today? And here are my impediments or roadblocks that I need assistance with to ensure that I meet the task or the sprint deadline at the end of the week. So that is your daily stand-up meeting that happens on a daily basis. To put this into a bit of practice, this is what a team room would look like at a business. So you'd have your signed values or rules of engagement. If your team has any values that they've set themselves at the beginning of a project, you'd have the team calendar that would explain, when everyone's around. Those are just basic project management things. But the real Scrum items are your product backlog, which you can see is at the bottom. That's the long list of items that the team will tackle over the next 12 to 24 months. You then have your sprint backlog, which is above that, which is just the top item of that product backlog broken up into much smaller, more manageable tasks. And then you have your backlog board, which is your sprint board, which is each of the items that's in the sprint backlog broken up into a backlog item that you're going to be working on in that sprint. And this team, you can see they've used, instead of using different color stickies to denote the different weeks, they've used different color stickies to denote the different people in the team. So there's a person who's responsible for red stickies, green stickies, yellow stickies, pink stickies, and then light green stickies, blue stickies. So you can very easily see the person who's pink has already completed one of their tasks. Everyone else, and the person who's red has completed one because it's in the done column. Everyone else is still busy with the task, so it's in the doing column. Okay, so I know that is a lot to take in. It's almost like a dump of information. Your 3 roles, your 3 meetings, and your 3 artifacts. But what does it look like on one page? And let's see if we can pull it all together in a way that makes sense. So I tried to document what this will look like from beginning to end. You can see that anything that's got a green dot is a role. Anything that's got a yellowy orange dot is a meeting or a ceremony. And anything that's got a blue dot is one of the artifacts that we spoke about. So the key process of Scrum or Agile is you're using input from your customers and your teams and your managers and your execs. You're using input from everyone to decide what you're going to be working on. So that's where we start with the product owner at number 1. He gets input from all of those people, and ultimately he sets the vision and builds and refines the product backlog, which is right below there, number 4. And the product backlog is your ruthlessly ranked list of items and initiatives that your team is going to be working on over the next 12 to 24 months. The Agile team then meets and they decide during the sprint planning meeting what part of that product backlog they're going to be tackling in that sprint. So they break down one of the items in the product backlog, or 2 of the items, depending how detailed they are in the product backlog. They break those down into very, very small, micro manageable tasks and assign each of those tasks to different people within the sprint team. And remember, that sprint or that Agile team is that multidisciplinary team of different people from around the business, 3 to 7 people who are all working to tackle the items that are in the sprint backlog. So you've now broken up your items from your sprint planning meeting. You've discussed who's going to be doing what, and you've documented them in your sprint backlog, and you've moved those items onto your sprint board, whether that's a digital board or whether that's a physical board in your office. And from that, you run in your cycles of your 1 to 2 or 1 to 4 week sprints, depending on your business. I would recommend 1 week sprint by default, especially when you get started, to get everyone into the rhythm of running sprints. And ultimately, the Scrum Master, which is number 3 there, is responsible for facilitating that sprint process and making sure that the team knows exactly what they're working on and removing impediments. The Scrum Master is also responsible, which is sometimes overlooked, for protecting the team from working on items that are not on the sprint backlog. Now, in business, there's a lot of other things that often come up. if someone in the Agile team gets asked to work on something that is not in the sprint backlog, it is the Scrum Master's responsibility to either reprioritize the sprint backlog to make sure that that item is included if it is important, and move an item off the sprint backlog that should no longer be there, or it's their responsibility to push back on whoever is assigning additional tasks to that team member and say, I'm really sorry, we've defined our sprint progress for the week. Please, will you put that item in the product backlog managed by the product owner, who will then decide in terms of priority where it fits in the product backlog, and it will be addressed accordingly. You then have your daily stand-up meetings, which is every 24 hours, where the team meets on a daily basis and asks themselves the 3 key questions. What did I do yesterday? What am I doing today? And what impediments need to be removed? And ultimately, at the end of the sprint, you have your sprint output, which is that minimal viable product or minimal shippable product that can be shared with both the product owner and your customer to get their feedback and to implement any changes required to that product. So that on a 1 page is what the sprint process looks like. We've tackled some of these issues already. These again just talks to the Agile Manifesto. I don't necessarily need to go that. This is a very nice summary as to the main differences between Agile and Waterfall. And you can see, so Waterfall is that long process over time. It has large functional teams, heavy customer involvement only at the very beginning and at the very end, nothing in the design, development, integration, and test phases. Your design is very predictable. Your development, you build all the features at once under Waterfall. Your testing and integration only happens at the very end, not over time. And you have very large infrequent releases of products. Whereas under Agile, you have these small cross-functional teams. There's constant collaboration with the teams. It's very modular. You design each feature as you go rather than all the features at once. It's very iterative. There's continuous real-time testing and feedback from your customers. And it's very rapid and incremental and frequent releases rather than the slow releases. Now to end, a lot of people always ask, this is the question, is Agile suitable for me, or is Agile suitable for my business? And the truth is that it's not always suitable. In many cases it isn't, but what this chart shows is some of the cases where Agile is very, very beneficial and some of the cases where it is not. And one of the key, I won't go through everything on this slide, but one of the key issues around Agile is it really involves you to empower your teams to get the work done in the way they best see fit. So it removes the impact of micromanagement. So where you have people in your team that you do not necessarily trust to get the work done and to manage their own time, that is one of the big difficulties of Agile, both from that person enabling themselves to be able to operate without being micromanaged, as well as the manager having the ability to let go and give that person the freedom to manage themselves, which is a very big change that sometimes takes quite a lot of time. And also Agile is not very appropriate where the impact of mistakes can be catastrophic. So for example, if you're performing open heart surgery, you don't really want to be at risk of making a mistake along the way and having to correct it, because your mistakes can be catastrophic. It can result in the loss of life in that extreme circumstance. So in those circumstances, it is much better to go back to the old version of Waterfall, where you plan out every single step to the T and you then execute that plan over time. While it's not the most convenient and the most efficient, because you have to eliminate all mistakes, it is required. However, if you're developing a product, for example, you're trying to sell a new car, it's much better to share an early version of what your new car looks like with a customer and get his feedback and you get the feedback early and you can make changes, than only show him the completed vehicle at the very end once everything has been done and then you find out the customer actually doesn't like the car. So those are the 2 key issues as to when Agile is suitable or not. The ground rules for Agile. So I think it's worth sharing these because these are the things that need to be reinforced in your team. So under Agile, everyone is equal. There's no titles. The cross-functional team operates equally. Everyone gets a voice. it is very important, because those Scrum meetings are so short, that everyone is very punctual and respects each other's time. Everyone needs to try their best, communicate proactively, and all contribute together as one cross-functional team to create the output that is set forth in the sprint plan. Great, so thank you very much. I hope that session was beneficial. I'll now open up the floor to any questions, if there's anyone that has any questions that they would like to ask. I think, if possible, let's maybe try and ask the questions in the chat box so we can try and get through as many questions as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. There are a couple of questions that I have on the chat box that I will actually ask you. I don't know which one is better. Do you want me to ask you all the questions and you answer them, or do you want one question at a time? Which one will work better for you?
I think one question at a time will work better for me, please. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. All right. The first question that I have is, how would you predict the cost of implementing agile processes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, as I mentioned earlier, implementation of anything new is challenging. And it's specifically more difficult when you're trying to change the way that people have been working for a very long time. So I think a lot of the larger corporates have been implementing Agile for a long time. It's been quite a trendy topic for the last 3 or 4 years now in the corporate space, specifically in the US and in Europe. And a lot of South African large corporates are busy going through that process now in terms of implementing Agile. It's definitely not without its challenges in terms of implementation. And what you'll find is there's a big resistance to change, especially from some of the older individuals in the organization who've been there for a long time. But ultimately, if you can get through the teething process and you can get through the implementation process of changing people's mindsets in your team, and they can start seeing the benefits of Agile themselves and how their own productivity and their own work-life balance has improved over time, the implementation becomes much, much easier.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that answer. That question was from Reshma. Okay, I've got another statement that is actually from SCRUM Somi, not necessarily a question. And he's saying, as early adopters for our team, we find that digital tools like Slack have made us more agile. I would highly recommend it. He's also actually shared a link as well to Slack.
Yeah, that's a fantastic comment. So Slack is a very, very useful digital tool. For those of you who haven't used it, it's almost a cross between a WhatsApp and a Trello, where you can actually have different groups for different teams within your organization, and you can share information accordingly. So I would highly recommend that you have a look at Slack as well. Thanks for that. Thanks for that comment.
All right. So there's another question from Veroshka. The question is, does Agile work for large construction projects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the construction is an interesting one, because you obviously have to have your plans very, very sorted up front in terms of what you need to execute over time. So I don't think your planning process for construction projects necessarily changes that much. But the way in which your team executes the plan over time can be run in an agile manner. So the utilization of sprint boards, the utilization of a product backlog in terms of what you're doing when, and the management of that process in terms of having a scrum master that's focused on who is doing what and keeping you to those micro deadlines, that can definitely be applied in any context, including construction.
Awesome. Thank you. There's another question from Andrew Lehman. He's saying, I'm considering the implications on staff recruitment. Agile does not favor raw rate jobs into which less experienced, less qualified are often accommodated.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. I think that kind of speaks to my point before the slide as to who Agile is applicable for. If you have very entry-level staff that require a little bit more micromanagement, it may be necessary if you do implement Agile for the Scrum Master to become a lot more hands-on and actually drive the process in terms of what those individuals are doing each day. It doesn't mean that you cannot implement Agile. It just means that as I said, your Scrum Master needs to micromanage the team a lot more, and you can still use some of the principles in terms of the Scrum board and having those daily stand-up meetings on a daily basis to ensure that your team is on track to meet their weekly targets. But it is a very valid point. What we often find is with Agile, it's much easier to implement from the top down than the bottom up. So you need to get the buy-in of all your key stakeholders, specifically the CEO and top management, to agree to start operating in an Agile way. And then from the top, it's much easier to cascade that process down than it is to try and start it at the bottom and move it up. Because if you have a senior management team that is specifically looking at trying to plan their lives on a waterfall basis and setting themselves tasks and goals and things they want to achieve each year using a waterfall chart, but you have your teams and your business operating as Agile, that disconnect is going to create huge friction in the business and it's going to cause big problems.
Awesome. This actually links to the next question, or rather statement from Seshni. One of the biggest success factors would be management and client support. Having clients and management that understand Agile and they're willing to support it goes a long way in ensuring success. Without this, it becomes really difficult for the Agile team to live the Agile way. And I think rather it's a statement linking to what you were just saying. I don't know if you want to add something on that one.
No, I 100% agree. And I think you mustn't underestimate how keen a lot of customers are to get involved in the Agile process as well. I think management is a bit more of a challenge because a lot of them have been there for much longer. Very, very critical to get them aligned almost first before you start the process. But customers are often very, very excited to be actually physically involved in the development of the product or the service that you are trying to share with them, because they feel as though the solution that they're developing is much more aligned to their needs and their requirements. So from my experience, it's much, much easier to get customers aligned with Agile because they enjoy the experience of being involved. But it's a very, very valid and true statement. Senior management in particular, it's critical that they are the first people on board in any form of Agile implementation.
I agree with you. Another question from Stephen. What skills and qualifications, apart from knowledge of Scrum process, does the Scrum Master need? That is, how do you choose a suitable Scrum Master?
Yeah, very good question. So the Scrum Master doesn't necessarily have to be someone who's very senior. But inevitably, it normally is someone who has a slightly senior role, because one of their big job is being able to clear those impediments that arise throughout the Scrum process. And in order to clear impediments, that person needs to have good connections and good relationships with all the key stakeholders in the business, because often those impediments aren't necessarily external, they're actually internal impediments that need to be sorted out before you can proceed. So a very common one is someone in the Scrum team might need access to data that they can't get access to because they don't have authorization and they need to get approval. And that's something that then the Scrum Master would then need to go and take to the required person in order to get approval, and then take it to the IT team to allow access so that the team can proceed with the project. Now, while you don't necessarily have to be senior to do that, you do have to know everyone within the organization and be socialized with all the moving parts of the organization. So normally it's best suited to someone who has been around for quite a while. Another good point, which I can't remember if I mentioned, is the Scrum Master can also be a member of the Agile team. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. So, but the Scrum Master's role is purely just to facilitate those meetings and clear impediments. So as long as they are able to do that, there's not necessarily any additional training that they require. If you do want to actually really implement this and do it properly, there is a certification that's run by different agencies that where you can become a certified Scrum Master. And that course, I think, is one day long, and it actually takes you through all the complex processes of being a Scrum Master, how you should act, what you should do, and a couple of exercises as well. And then you can actually be certified as a certified Scrum Master, which will allow you to implement this at other organizations as well. But that's just an aside.
Awesome. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Seshini. I see Seshini has actually shared with us a link in terms of the qualities of a good Scrum Master based on the question above. So for those who are able to access it, it will give you more details. So there's another question, I think that will be the last question today, that is closer home. With the adoption of Agile Scrum, where does it put the future of traditional project managers?
No, very good question. So my answer to that is, so I've been using Agile now using and implementing at other businesses for 3 or 4 years. And I have seen firsthand the benefits of Agile. And I would say that I don't think traditional project management is extinct. There's always going to be a use for it. And the skills that you've learned in traditional project management are always going to be very beneficial in the way in which you manage your teams and you deal with people. However, going forward, I would think that traditional project managers would do themselves a favor to familiarize themselves with Agile and start trying to implement some of the core concepts that we've discussed today, so that they can see the benefits for themselves. Because ultimately, I think that traditional form of project management in terms of the waterfall approach and how it was applied is slowly going to get phased out over time as more and more firms and businesses move towards this Agile approach. That's going to be really, really, the speed is going to be increased as a result of new technology and an ever-changing world that we're living in at the moment.
Awesome. Great. Thank you very much. Dr. Basil is going to give a vote of thanks. Just on my side, I just want to thank you for your time. And again, something that actually stands out for me is the ability of Agile to make us to be able to adjust the priorities. I think it's key for us, because I think this pandemic has actually made us aware that we cannot actually be rigid. You need to move faster, because things were actually changing very fast. And I think it comes out with some of the organizations who have like Unilever. So what they did, they converted their factory lines from actually producing deodorants, and then they decided to produce sanitizers. So it's something that they had to move very fast in terms of actually make those type of decisions. And the other most important thing is the collaboration, because I think for you to be able to implement Agile, you need to collaborate with with the other resources who are working within the team. So there's different stakeholders. You need to understand what actually is required from the business perspective, getting it from the product owner. So there's so much, and I think it helps again with the transparency, because we've seen in organizations where people actually leave with actually the knowledge of the organization because there's no collaboration. So it is important. I think it's something that actually will help most of the organizations for them to be successful. So I'm going to now hand over to Dr. Basil, who's going to give us a vote of thanks. Thank you once again.
Many thanks, Program Director, for the excellent directing skills. And I must put a confession forward that the Program Director is my student in my class. But just because I'm giving you a compliment doesn't mean you will get more marks for that. But thank you so much for directing the program so well. You did very well, very professional and excellent. Stuart, we owe you a big thanks as a school. I've worked with you on another project, and you did very well. I was quite inspired by your professionalism and your expertise, actually. I think one takeaway from me is the Scrum Master. I think I just want to be a certified Scrum Master. I'll reach a point that when we implement Agile in our school, I will be that Scrum Master. Thank you so much for assisting us. You know, our role as a university, particularly as a graduate school of business, is to make the private sector and government converge. And then also we have a responsibility as a graduate school of sharpening the intellectual rigorness of business people, individuals, and students. So you've actually assisted us by coming on board and then sharing your experience with our audience, the university community, which is quite diverse, from business to private sector and public sector as well, and students as well. So thank you so much for coming on board. And we hope this is not the last one. I'm quite confident that we will continue to collaborate. But also, again, you've assisted us with the mandate of university in terms of being part of the triple helix model, which is summarized as the contribution of government, which is public sector and private sector, as well as the university community, where we converge in terms of dealing with the ills of the society. So you've assisted us to a great deal in terms of executing that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our audience, which is very diverse. Thank you so much to people like Andrew. I know he assisted in the review of GSB strategy some years back. So we've got a diverse audience today. And thank you so much to the people who have embraced us with their presence in this webinar. But let me thank my colleagues, particularly Hazel from the PR office, for assisting us with the organization of this. Thank you to Prof. Martins, our Dean and Head of School. Thank you so much, Prof. And to my colleague, Crowley. Thank you to each and every one of you. Thanks to members of BMF who have also joined. And I think it's my instruction to you that you should have a blessed, safe, and a happy festive season. Till we meet again. I'm sure we'll meet in the next year because there's a MOU between us and Nolands. So we will make a point that we bring exciting things to assist the community, to assist government, to assist the private sector. So thank you so much for coming, and we're looking forward to further engagements. And have a great day from now on. Thank you, colleagues. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.